November 8, 1942. Sidi Farouk Beach, Algeria. The surf is black. The sky is moonless. American infantry wade ashore with rifles held high, boots filling with water, hearts pounding under the weight of enemy fire. Among the men dragging themselves through the sand are teams hauling heavy wooden crates. They are stenciled with a single word: secret. No one explains what's inside. No manuals, no training. Orders are clear: do not open them until the fighting begins. Somewhere beyond the dunes, enemy tanks are moving, steel engines growling in the dark, weapons that until now infantrymen have learned to fear more than bullets. Inside those crates is something new, something crude, a hollow steel tube, barely more than scrap metal welded together. Most of the soldiers carrying it have never fired one. Some don't even know what it does. And yet, on this beach, under fire, the United States Army is about to gamble the lives of its infantry on that simple tube, hoping it can do what no weapon has done before. Before 1942, every infantryman knew the truth about tanks. If armor appeared, you ran. If you couldn't run, you hid. And if you couldn't hide, you died. Anti-tank rifles had once promised protection. Now they were relics, their rounds bouncing harmlessly off thicker armor. Field guns could stop tanks, but they were heavy, slow, and impossible to move with advancing infantry. When tanks broke through, those guns were usually lost before they could be turned. What remained were desperate measures: grenades thrown at tracks, Molotov cocktails hurled at engine decks, men sprinting across open ground to press explosives against steel. It worked sometimes, and when it failed fatally. German armored doctrine understood this imbalance perfectly. Tanks were meant to move fast, operate independently, and terrorize infantry into submission. The psychological effect mattered as much as firepower. A tank didn't have to fire to win. Its presence alone could collapse a defense. By 1941, the battlefield equation was brutally simple. Tanks dominated open ground. Infantry endured them. Every major army knew the problem. Every major army searched for a solution. What none of them had solved was how to give ordinary foot soldiers a weapon that could follow them anywhere, into cities, forests, mountains, and ruins, and let them fight back on equal terms. Until now. The solution did not come from a grand design bureau or a long research program. It came together in a single morning at Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland. May 6, 1942. Colonel Leslie Skinner and Lieutenant Edward Uhl were scheduled to demonstrate a series of anti-tank weapons to senior Army officers. Most of those weapons were impressive on paper, heavy, complex, and expensive. They required trained crews, careful positioning, and time the infantry rarely had. Uhl arrived with something else. He had found a steel tube in a scrap pile. It happened to be the right diameter. There were no factory sights, so he bent a wire coat hanger into shape with pliers. The firing mechanism was simple electrical wiring, powered by ordinary dry cell batteries. The launcher had been assembled that very morning, using whatever materials were available. To the assembled generals, it looked ridiculous. The tests began. One after another, the approved weapons fired at a moving M3 Stuart tank from over 100 yards away. Crews struggled to track the target. Shots missed. The tank kept rolling. Then Uhl stepped forward. Unsure what would happen, he pulled on a welder's mask, braced the tube on his shoulder, lined up the crude wire sights, and fired. The rocket flew straight and slammed into the tank's side. 5 seconds later, he reloaded and fired again. Another hit. The range was shorter, the design was crude, but the result was undeniable. Major General Gladian Barnes, head of Army Ordnance Research, picked up the Otter launcher and turned it over in his hands. He reportedly laughed and said it looked like a comedian's homemade instrument, a bazooka. Then he gave the order. 5,000 units. Immediate production. There would be no perfection phase, no long trials, no refinement. War did not have time for elegance. Once the order was given, the pace became relentless. Factories that had never built weapons before were told to start welding steel tubes. There were no special alloys, no precision machining, no complicated optics. Each launcher required little more than basic metalwork and simple electrical components. The entire system could be built for about $25. Within weeks, production lines were running. Within months, thousands of launchers were ready. There was no time to perfect them. There was barely time to explain them. By October 1942, crates were being sealed and marked secret. The launchers were shipped overseas alongside men who had never seen one. Fired. Training manuals were thin, ammunition was rushed, rockets were packed for a long sea voyage through heat, spray, and salt air. Then came Operation Torch. As Allied forces prepared to land in North Africa, General Dwight Eisenhower made a last-minute discovery. Entire units had received the new weapon without instruction. Orders forbade opening the crates before the invasion. No one had practiced with it. No one knew how it would behave in combat. When the fighting began, confusion followed. Some rockets failed to ignite, others misfired. A few detonated prematurely. Soldiers learned by trial, sometimes under direct fire. Reports from the first days were grim and uneven. And yet, amid the failures, something remarkable happened. When the rockets worked, tanks stopped, steel was pierced, crews bailed out. The weapon was unreliable, crude, barely understood. But it had done the impossible. Infantrymen who had once been helpless were now standing their ground, and somewhere in the chaos of retreat and advance, abandoned American equipment began falling into enemy hands, including that simple steel tube. In North Africa, theory collided with reality. The Bazooka's first battlefield was chaos, dust, smoke, confused orders, and unfamiliar terrain. Many of the rockets had been damaged during transport. Moisture seeped into propellant. Electrical contacts failed. Some launchers simply refused to fire. When tanks appeared, panic returned. Men fumbled with wiring. Others pressed triggers and heard nothing. A few rockets sputtered out of the tube and dropped harmlessly into the sand. In some units, the weapon was discarded altogether, written off as another experiment rushed too quickly into combat. The after-action reports were blunt. Rockets failed to ignite. Rockets detonated early. Crews lacked instruction. At times, the bazooka seemed to confirm every doubt about untested weapons. But scattered among the failures were moments that changed everything. Near Port Lyautey, American anti-tank teams faced advancing Vichy French armor. Under fire, two soldiers shouldered the unfamiliar launcher, aimed instinctively, and fired. The rocket struck the tank's side. The armor split. The crew escaped or burned. Combat logs recorded the result without drama. New rocket weapon effective when functioning properly. Those few words carried enormous weight. Within days, soldiers began experimenting. They learned firing distances by instinct. They learned where armor was weakest. They learned that the weapon worked best up close, dangerously close. Confidence grew unevenly, but it grew. For the first time, infantry units had something they could carry with them that might stop a tank. Not always, not reliably, but often enough to matter. And when American forces were pushed back during the fighting that followed, especially in the confused retreat toward Kasserine Pass, equipment was left behind, weapons, ammunition, and intact bazookas. German troops recovered them from abandoned positions and damaged vehicles. They packed them up and sent them east toward Berlin for analysis. The Americans had proven the idea could work. Now, the enemy was about to study it. In February 1943, the tide in North Africa turned violently. At Kasserine Pass, German armored units overran American positions with speed and experience. In the confusion of withdrawal, U.S. forces abandoned vehicles, supply dumps, and newly issued equipment scattered across the desert. Among the wreckage were weapons the Germans had never seen before. Intact bazookas, unfired rockets, crates marked in English. German troops recognized immediately that this was no ordinary infantry weapon. The launchers were collected, documented, and rushed out of the combat zone. Within days, they were on their way to Berlin. At the Wehrmacht's weapons testing facilities, German engineers examined the launchers piece by piece. What they found was unsettling, not because of complexity, but because of its absence. The weapon was light, simple, crude. It required no special steel, no advanced optics, no skilled crew. A single soldier could carry it, two could operate it effectively. German test reports noted that it could be mass-produced using basic industrial facilities and minimal training. Most alarming of all was the warhead. At close range, it could penetrate armor that infantry weapons had never been able to defeat, not by speed, but by chemistry. A shaped charge that focused explosive force into steel. For German planners, this posed a far deeper problem than a single new weapon. Their armored doctrine depended on freedom of movement. Tanks were meant to advance aggressively, forcing infantry to scatter. But a man-portable weapon that could be hidden anywhere, behind walls, in forests, inside ruins, threatened that entire system. The conclusion in Berlin was swift. The Americans had not built a better anti-tank gun. They had changed the battlefield itself. German engineers were ordered to respond immediately. They would build their own version of the weapon, stronger, larger, more powerful. And in doing so, they would reveal the difference between copying a design and understanding the idea behind it. The German response was fast, confident, and predictable. If the Americans had built a simple rocket launcher, German engineers would build a better one. They increased the warhead diameter, they strengthened the launcher, they pushed penetration far beyond the original design. By late 1943, the result entered service as the Panzerschreck, a weapon capable of punching through even the heaviest Allied armor. On paper, it outperformed the Bazooka in nearly every category. The warhead was larger, the penetration deeper, the blast more violent, but power came with weight. The launcher was heavier and bulkier. Crews needed protective shields to survive the backblast. Training requirements increased. Production demanded more man-hours, more materials, more precision. Where the American weapon had been built to be good enough, the German version chased superiority. And that difference mattered. The Bazooka was designed to be everywhere. The Panzerschreck was designed to be formidable. American factories could turn out launchers by the tens of thousands. Any facility with basic welding equipment could build them. German production was slower, more centralized, more vulnerable. On the battlefield, the contrast became clear. American infantry units treated the Bazooka as standard equipment. It moved with rifle squads, crossed rivers, climbed hills, and slipped through alleys. German rocket teams, fewer in number, were powerful, but rare. Germany had copied the tube. They had copied the warhead. What they had not copied was the philosophy behind it. The Bazooka was not meant to be the best weapon on the battlefield. It was meant to be the most common. And while German engineers refined their answer, American infantry were about to discover what that difference meant, not in laboratories or factories, but in cities reduced to rubble and streets measured in meters. By the summer of 1943, the Bazooka was no longer a novelty. In Sicily, American units arrived with improved launchers and more reliable rockets. The men carrying them now understood what the weapon could and could not do. Training was still brief, sometimes only a few hours, but it was enough. What mattered was not mastery. It was belief. For the first time, infantry felt they had a chance. In the narrow streets of Sicilian towns, tanks could no longer rely on speed. Stone walls and sharp corners forced them to slow, to turn cautiously, to expose their sides. Bazooka teams waited in doorways and rubble piles, aiming not for glory, but for opportunity. One extraordinary shot pierced a tank through its vision slit, killing the driver and halting the advance. It was not typical. It did not need to be. Stories like it spread faster than orders. By the time the fighting moved onto the Italian mainland, the change was unmistakable. The terrain favored the defender. Medieval towns clung to hillsides. Roads were narrow. Buildings were thick with stone. Bazooka teams learned to avoid the streets altogether. Instead, they blasted holes through walls, moving from house to house, appearing where tanks did not expect them. Canadian and American units documented the same tactic again and again. Urban fighting no longer belonged to armor. The psychological effect was immediate. Tank crews began buttoning up earlier. They hesitated before entering towns. They waited for infantry to clear every building, every alley, every upper floor. Progress slowed. Momentum bled away. Colonel James Gavin, commanding airborne forces in Italy, later noted that the Bazooka had given infantry confidence that could not be measured in destroyed vehicles. Alone. Tanks were sometimes abandoned without being hit at all, crews choosing escape over entrapment. This shift mattered more than raw numbers. A weapon carried by two men had changed how entire formations moved. Infantry were no longer obstacles to be crushed. They were hunters, shaping the battlefield in advance of armor. By late 1943, German war diaries reflected the same realization. Enemy infantry, equipped with rocket weapons, now dominated close terrain. The bazooka did not eliminate tanks. It made them cautious. And in war, hesitation is deadly. As fighting moved north, toward the mountains of Italy and eventually the hedgerows of France, that hesitation would become permanent, written not just into experience, but into doctrine. By late 1943, the change was no longer anecdotal. It was official. German armored units began receiving new directives, orders that would have been unthinkable just 2 years earlier. Tanks were no longer to operate freely in urban areas. Infantry support was now mandatory. Every building had to be cleared before armor advanced. Every street was to be treated as a potential ambush. Speed, once the foundation of German armored warfare, was replaced by caution. Tank crews were instructed to keep their distance from structures. 100 meters from uncleared buildings became doctrine. Vehicles that had once led assaults now waited behind infantry, engines idling, commanders scanning windows instead of horizons. At the same time, German tanks themselves began to change. Steel side skirts appeared along hulls and turrets, not to stop shells, but to disrupt shaped charges. Crews welded spare track links onto armor. Sandbags, concrete, anything that might absorb an explosive jet was added in the field. From late 1943 onward, many vehicles were coated in Zimmerit paste, an anti-magnetic layer developed in response to infantry-carried weapons. Each modification added weight, each added complexity, each reduced mobility. Captured German documents revealed the cost clearly. Armored units reported that shock tactics were no longer viable. Methodical advance was now required. Infantry had to lead. Tanks could no longer exploit breakthroughs on their own. The battlefield had been rewritten. A tank entering a town was no longer a symbol of dominance. It was a liability. Every upper floor, every pile of rubble, every hedge line became a threat. The presence of enemy infantry meant uncertainty, and uncertainty slowed everything. What had once been German doctrine, the aggressive independent use of armor, had collapsed under the pressure of a weapon small enough to carry on a shoulder. The bazooka did not defeat German tanks by destroying them all. It defeated them by controlling where they could go. And in doing so, it set the stage for the next test, a landscape that would magnify every weakness armor had left. Normandy. When Allied forces landed in Normandy in June 1944, the battlefield looked nothing like the open deserts of North Africa. Here, the land itself was an enemy. Fields were divided by thick hedgerows, earthen walls topped with dense vegetation, some centuries old. Roads were sunken. Visibility was measured in yards, not miles. Tanks could not maneuver freely. They funneled forward, slow and exposed, their flanks hidden one moment and vulnerable the next. For bazooka teams, it was ideal. American infantry moved through the bocage cautiously, slipping between hedges, crawling through gaps, cutting firing ports into the earth itself. A tank advancing down a narrow lane could be engaged from the side or rear before its crew ever saw the threat. The ranges were short, often less than 100 yards, sometimes far closer. At those distances, the bazooka was deadly enough. After-action reports from the first weeks in Normandy began to tell a consistent story. German armor advanced more slowly than expected. Tank commanders hesitated. Reconnaissance increased. Infantry was pushed forward at every step, searching for threats that could not be seen until it was too late. In the American sector, bazooka teams accounted for a significant portion of disabled and destroyed armored vehicles. Many others were abandoned intact, crews unwilling to push into terrain where death could come from any direction. What mattered most was not the number of tanks destroyed, but the time lost. Every hedge had to be cleared, every village approached with caution, every advance slowed by fear of unseen infantry. German armor had once been the instrument of breakthrough. In Normandy, it became reactive, responding to terrain and infantry rather than shaping the battle itself. The bazooka did not dominate Normandy alone. Artillery, aircraft, and tanks all played their part. But in the hedgerows, where range collapsed and surprise ruled, the simple rocket launcher proved its value again and again. It ensured that German armor could never regain its momentum. And as the fighting ground forward through France, another truth became impossible to ignore. The outcome was no longer being decided by brilliance or design, but by numbers. By mid-1944, the bazooka's greatest advantage was no longer surprise, it was scale. American factories were producing rocket launchers by the tens of thousands. The design had been refined just enough: stronger tubes, more reliable ignition, improved rockets, but never complicated. Any plant with basic welding equipment could build them. Training new workers took days, not months. The math was unforgiving. A single bazooka cost roughly $25 to produce. Each rocket cost only a few more. For the price of one medium tank, the U.S. Army could field thousands of launchers and tens of thousands of rounds. German production told a different story. The Panzerschreck was powerful, but expensive in time and labor. It required far more man-hours to build, and specialized materials Germany increasingly lacked. While hundreds of thousands were eventually produced, they never appeared in the numbers German units needed. On paper, German rocket weapons were superior. On the battlefield, they were outnumbered. American infantry battalions now carried dozens of bazookas as standard equipment. Every company had teams trained to use them. Ammunition flowed through ordinary supply chains, not special depots. The result was a form of pressure German armor could not escape. Even when no bazooka was fired, its presence shaped decisions. Tank commanders assumed it was there, behind the next hedge, inside the next building, above the next street corner. This was not a contest of engineering brilliance. It was a contest of systems. Germany built weapons to be exceptional. The United States built weapons to be everywhere. And as the war moved toward its final year, that difference became decisive. Even as the bazooka became standard equipment, it was never finished. Combat revealed flaws as quickly as factories corrected them. In winter, batteries failed in freezing temperatures. Soldiers learned to keep them warm inside their jackets. Rockets burned differently in extreme cold, shortening range and altering flight. Crews adapted instinctively, closing distance, aiming for engine decks and rear armor. Where doctrine struggled, improvisation filled the gap. By late 1944, new models replaced battery ignition with magnetos, eliminating one of the weapon's greatest weaknesses. Launchers were redesigned to break into sections for airborne troops. Rockets were reshaped to prevent deflection on angled armor. And sometimes, adaptation went far beyond manuals. In September 1944, an American artillery officer named Charles Carpenter took the idea to its extreme. Flying a light observation aircraft over the battlefield, he mounted multiple bazookas to its wings. From low altitude, he attacked German armor directly, destroying tanks that never expected threat from above. It was unconventional, unofficial, and devastating. The episode captured the essence of the weapon itself. The bazooka was never about elegance or tradition. It was about solving problems faster than the enemy could adapt. And that flexibility, born from a scrap metal tube and carried forward by soldiers in the field, would shape what came next, long after the war itself moved toward its end. By the final year of the war, the transformation was complete. Only a few years earlier, the appearance of enemy armor had sent infantry scattering. Tanks were forces of nature, unstoppable, inevitable, terrifying. Men were trained to endure them, not confront them. The bazooka changed that relationship. Training manuals were rewritten, infantry doctrine evolved. Every battalion now included multiple rocket teams, and every soldier understood the basics of their use. Anti-tank defense was no longer a specialist's task, it was shared. Knowledge. With that change came confidence. Soldiers no longer waited for tanks to pass, they planned for them. Ambush positions were chosen in advance, fire was coordinated. Multiple teams worked together, striking from different angles, forcing crews to react instead of advance. German post-war interrogations reflected the same shift. Tank commanders described constant tension, the need to assume that enemy infantry were always armed with rocket weapons. Movement slowed not because tanks were destroyed, but because they were threatened everywhere. The psychological balance had reversed. Infantry no longer felt hunted. They felt capable. The effect spread beyond Europe. In the Pacific, bazookas were used not only against Japanese armor, but against bunkers, caves, and fortified positions. Rockets that could breach steel also shattered concrete and stone, giving infantry a versatile tool wherever terrain limited heavier weapons. By the war's end, the principle had become universal. Every modern army adopted some form of portable anti-tank weapon. Designs evolved, calibers changed, but the idea remained the same. Give ordinary soldiers the power to stop extraordinary machines. The bazooka did not win the war by itself, but it changed who could fight it. The bazooka was never supposed to be elegant. It wasn't designed by a committee chasing perfection or built from rare materials meant to impress. It began as scrap metal, bent wire, and borrowed batteries, assembled in haste because the battlefield demanded an answer. And that was its power. In a war defined by massive machines and industrial might, the bazooka shifted strength downward. It placed decisive force in the hands of ordinary soldiers. Men who once watched tanks roll toward them helplessly now waited in silence, choosing the moment to strike. German armor entered the war as the symbol of modern warfare, fast, independent, terrifying. By its end, those same tanks moved cautiously, tied to infantry, slowed by fear of weapons they could not see. The change did not come from brilliance alone, it came from abundance. American factories did not try to build the best anti-tank weapon in the world. They built one that could be made anywhere, carried everywhere, and replaced without hesitation. In doing so, they transformed the infantryman from a victim of armored warfare into its equal. That idea outlived the war. Every modern battlefield still carries its echo, shoulder-fired weapons designed to stop vehicles once thought unstoppable. The shapes have changed, the names are different, but the principle remains the same. Sometimes victory does not belong to the most advanced machine. It belongs to the side that gives ordinary people the tools to fight back. If you found this story worth remembering, consider sharing your thoughts below. Had you heard how such a simple weapon reshaped the battlefield? And do you think modern warfare still favors simplicity over perfection?